Evening, friend. Come sit by the fire. Pour yourself something warm. The night is quiet out there. Just the wind moving through the grass and the stars doing what stars have always done. No need to rush. No need to think about tomorrow just yet. Tonight's story is about a young man who gave up everything a person can give up. His people, his language, his name. He walked into a town that didn't want him, looking for work that nobody would offer. And the one man who finally did never asked him a single question about any of it. Welcome to Western Sleep Story, where the Old West carries you to sleep. Every week, I sit by this fire and tell a new tale, slow, calm, with nothing but the crackle of the flame and a story worth drifting off to. If you're new here, you're welcome to stay as long as you like. And if these stories help you rest, that little subscribe button means you'll never have to look for the fire again. It'll be right here, waiting. Now, let me tell you about a boy who left everything and a man who gave him something to come back to. The morning he left, the sky was the color of ash. Not the dark ash of a fire gone cold, but the pale, thin gray of a fire that had burned all night and was only now deciding whether it had anything left to give. It was the kind of sky that didn't promise much, the kind that made a person feel like the world had not yet made up its mind about the day. His name, the name his mother had given him at birth, the name that had been spoken over him in ceremony, the name that carried within it the history of his father's father, was not a name he was willing to carry into the town below. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He had made that decision 3 nights ago, sitting alone by the river, listening to the water move over the stones with the patience of something that had been doing it for 10,000 years and would go on doing it for 10,000 more. He was 19 years old. His name, for now, would be nothing, a blank space, a silence where a word used to be. He had grown up in the high country of New Mexico, in a Lakota band that had moved south 2 generations before he was born, following the game and the grass and the particular quality of light that fell on certain valleys in the late afternoon of summer. His grandfather had been a man of standing. His father had been a man of standing. He had been expected, quietly, persistently, in the way that expectations settle around a person without ever being spoken aloud, to become a man of standing as well. But the world had changed. The world was still changing, and the changes were not gentle. The band had been under pressure for 4 years. Not the dramatic, sudden pressure of a single event, but the slow, grinding pressure of a world that was rearranging itself around them, whether they chose it or not. The land they had used was being fenced. The game was moving. The younger men were dividing into 2 camps. Those who believed the old ways could be preserved if they held firm, and those who believed something had to shift if anything was going to survive at all. He had belonged uncomfortably to neither camp. He had watched the arguments. He had listened to the elders. He had sat in silence through 3 long winters, feeling something pull at him from the south and the east, from the direction of the towns he had never entered, the language he had only partly learned, the world that was pressing in from every direction, but that he had never once seen up close. His mother had died in the second of those winters. A fever, 3 days from the first sign to the last breath. He had sat beside her through all of it, holding her hand, watching her face move through expressions he couldn't name, until it stopped moving altogether and settled into something peaceful and very far away. After that, the pull got stronger. He didn't leave in anger. That was the thing he most wanted to be understood about himself, though there was no one to understand it at the time, and he wasn't sure there would be anyone later either. He didn't leave because he hated his people, or his history, or the sound of his own language in the morning. He left because he felt, with a certainty that went deeper than thought, that if he stayed, he would become a man who was neither one thing nor another, and that a man who was neither one thing nor another was, in the end, a man who was nothing at all. He had said goodbye to his father the evening before, not in words. His father was not a man for words at moments like that, and neither was he. They had sat together by the fire for an hour, watching the flames, and at the end of it, his father had placed one hand briefly on his shoulder and then removed it, and that had been the farewell. He had taken his blanket, his knife, a small pouch of dried meat, and the worn pair of boots that had belonged to his uncle before they belonged to him. He had left before the camp woke. He had not looked back, not because he didn't want to, but because he had promised himself he wouldn't. And he was, above almost everything else, a person who kept his promises to himself. That had been 11 days ago. The town of Redstone, New Mexico, lay below him now in the pale morning light, a scatter of buildings along a single main street. A water tower, the thin gray column of smoke rising from what he guessed was a forge or a bakehouse. There were maybe 300 people down there. Maybe fewer. It was a small town, the kind that existed because the land around it needed a place to trade, and the people on the land needed a place to go when the loneliness got too heavy to carry alone. He stood at the top of the ridge for a long moment, looking down. His boots had worn through at the left heel sometime around the third day. He had repaired them with a strip of leather cut from his belt, but the repair had not held, and for the last 4 days he had been walking with a small stone's worth of New Mexico ground, working its way in through the gap with every step. He was hungry. He had eaten the last of the dried meat 2 days ago. He had found water along the way. A creek, a spring, a cattle trough at a ranch he had skirted wide around in the early hours of the morning. But food had been scarce, and his body was registering the fact with a dull, persistent urgency that made it hard to think about anything else for very long. He adjusted the blanket over his shoulder. He took a slow breath of the cool morning air. Then he walked down toward the smoke. The main street of Redstone was not yet fully awake when he came down off the ridge road and stepped onto the packed dirt of its edge. A dog came out from between 2 buildings and regarded him with professional suspicion, then lost interest and went back to its business. A woman in a gray dress crossed the street 30 yards ahead of him without looking up. From somewhere behind the general store, a rooster was conducting an argument with the morning that the morning did not appear to be winning. He walked slowly, taking it in. He had been in towns before, twice, both times with older men from the band, for trading purposes, both times brief and purposeful, and bracketed on both sides by the comfort of knowing exactly where he belonged and who he was. This was different. This time there was no purpose yet, no companion, and no clear sense of where any of it was going to lead. The forge was on the south end of the street, set back slightly from the main line of buildings. He had smelled it before he saw it. The particular combination of hot iron and coal smoke and the animal smell of horses that meant a working blacksmith rather than just a fire. The sound reached him a moment later. The steady, unhurried rhythm of a hammer on metal, the kind of rhythm that suggested a man who had been doing this for so long that the motion had become something close to breathing. He stopped at the edge of the forge yard. The blacksmith was a man of perhaps 55, heavily built, with forearms that told you everything you needed to know about how he had spent the last 30 years of his life. His hair was iron gray, cut short and practical. He wore a leather apron that had been repaired in several places with a careful, economical stitching of a man who did not believe in throwing things away before they had given everything they had to give. His name was Fletcher Kane. The boy did not know this yet. Fletcher was working a piece of iron into what would eventually be a hinge, a simple, functional object that required nonetheless a precise and patient hand. He did not look up when the boy stopped at the edge of the yard. He finished the pass he was working on, turned the iron, examined it, and then looked up with the unhurried calm of a man who was not easily startled. He looked at the boy for a long moment. He took in the worn boots, the blanket, the dark eyes that were doing their own assessment with a frankness that most people in Redstone would have found unsettling. He looked at the boy's hands, the way a blacksmith always looks at hands, because hands tell you more about a person than their face does, most of the time. Then he looked back at the iron on the anvil. "You looking for work?" he said. His voice was the kind of voice that had spent decades competing with the noise of a forge, low, flat, and carrying without effort. The boy said, "Yes." He turned the iron again, examined the angle of it. "You know how to work a bellows?" "I can learn." Fletcher considered this for a moment. Then he jerked his head toward the far side of the forge, toward a wooden rack of tools hung with the particular orderliness of a man who believed that every object had a correct place and that the correct place was where it was, always. "Hang your blanket on that hook," he said, "and find me a pair of tongs that'll fit this piece." That was all. No questions about where he had come from. No questions about his tribe, his family, his reason for being in Redstone. No questions about the name he wasn't using or the name he had left behind on a ridge 11 days' walk north of here. Just find me the right tongs. The boy found them. He handed them over. Fletcher took them without looking up, adjusted his grip on the iron, and continued working. And just like that, without ceremony, without paperwork, without any of the formal arrangements that the town of Redstone would later debate the wisdom of at considerable length. The boy had a job. He didn't have a name yet, but he had somewhere to be in the morning and something to do when he got there. For now, that was enough. Fletcher Kane was not a man given to explanation. This was a quality that would have frustrated most apprentices. It frustrated the 3 men who had tried to learn the trade from him over the previous decade. 2 had quit within a month, and 1 had lasted 6 weeks before Fletcher had quietly suggested, with the particular gentleness of a man who understood that some things were better acknowledged plainly, that perhaps the forge was not the right place for him. But the boy from the high country had grown up in a world where most of the important things were taught through watching, not telling, where you learned by being present while someone who knew what they were doing went ahead and did it, where silence was not an absence of communication but a form of it, sometimes the most precise form available. So when Fletcher worked a piece of iron without explaining what he was doing or why, the boy watched. He watched the way Fletcher read the color of the metal, the progression from black to deep red to bright orange to the pale, almost white heat that meant the iron was ready to move. He watched the angle of the hammer, the rotation of the tongs, the infinitely small adjustments that Fletcher made without seeming to think about them, the way a person breathes without deciding to. He asked questions when he needed to, no more than that. Fletcher answered them in the same register, plain, sufficient, without elaboration. The first time the boy asked a question, Fletcher had paused for a moment, just a fraction of a second, in a way that suggested he was mildly surprised to find that the question was the right question. After that, the pauses got shorter. By the end of the first week, they had established a rhythm. The boys slept in the small room at the back of the forge. a space that Fletcher had used for storage until 2 days after the boy arrived. When Fletcher had wordlessly moved the stored items to a corner of the main forge floor and put a cot in their place. No discussion, no offer, just the cot and the implication that it was there to be used. The town, meanwhile, was forming its opinions. Redstone was not a town that prided itself on cruelty. It was also not a town that would have claimed, if pressed, to harbor any particular prejudice. But it was a town in 1883 in New Mexico, in the particular moment in history when the frontier was being renegotiated in ways that produced strong feelings and stronger fears. And the sight of a young Lakota man working the forge of its most established tradesman produced a variety of reactions that ran the full spectrum from cautious curiosity to open hostility. Gideon Marsh, who ran the dry goods store 2 doors down, stopped by on the 3rd day to speak to Fletcher about it. He framed his concern in practical terms, something about the town's reputation, something about what the ranchers would think, something about setting precedents. Fletcher let him finish. Then he picked up his hammer and went back to work, which was, the town would learn, his way of indicating that a conversation was over. A group of younger men, ranch hands and day laborers mostly, the kind of men who spent their evenings at the Redstone saloon and their mornings regretting it, made a point of stopping outside the forge yard on the 4th day and conducting a conversation among themselves at a volume that was intended to be overheard. They said several things. The boy kept working the bellows. Fletcher kept shaping a wheel rim. Neither of them looked up. When the men had gone, Fletcher set down his hammer, drank from the water bucket, and handed it to the boy. "You'll hear worse than that," he said. "I know," the boy said. Fletcher nodded. He picked up his hammer. "Good," he said, and went back to work. It was, the boy would think later, one of the most useful things anyone had ever said to him. Not because it told him anything he didn't already know, but because it was said in a tone that made clear that the speaker considered the information to be a simple fact of the terrain rather than a prediction of catastrophe. The same tone Fletcher might have used to say, "The well's on the north side," or "The anvil runs a little cold in the mornings." Just, "This is how the land lies. Now you know it. Now we can keep working." The boy's hands were changing. He noticed it at the end of this 2nd week. The way the skin on his palms was thickening. The way certain muscles in his forearms and shoulders had begun to announce themselves with a clarity that was unfamiliar, but not unpleasant. He had always been strong. The high country demanded it. But this was a different kind of strength, more specific, more technical, the strength of a body learning a new vocabulary of motion. He was starting to hear the iron. That was how he thought about it. Not as a metaphor, but as a literal thing. He was starting to understand the sounds of the forge the way you understand a language you've been hearing long enough. Not word by word, but in whole phrases, in the rhythm and texture of meaning. The sound the hammer made when the iron was exactly right. The sound it made when it wasn't. The particular silence that meant Fletcher was about to do something that required full attention. He didn't have a name yet. Fletcher had never asked for one, and no one else in Redstone had asked either. Or rather, several people had asked, but the boy had given them nothing useful, and eventually they had stopped asking and settled for watching. But the hammer had a weight he was beginning to know. The iron had a heat he was beginning to read. The forge had a rhythm that was starting to feel, just slightly, like something that had room in it for him. That was not nothing. In fact, at that particular moment in his life, it was almost everything. 3 weeks after the boy arrived in Redstone, a man named Harlan Dowd came into Fletcher Kane's forge yard with a broken axle and a face like a weather system about to make a decision. Harlan Dowd ran cattle on 400 acres east of town. He was 60 years old, built like something that had been left out in a lot of weather and had not softened for it. And he had opinions about most things that he shared freely and without apparent concern for whether they were welcome. He was also, by the calculation of the town's economy, one of Fletcher Kane's most reliable customers, a man whose ranch produced, on a consistent basis, more ironwork repairs than almost anyone else in the county. He stood at the edge of the forge yard and looked at the boy, who was at that moment working the bellows with the steady, patient rhythm he had developed over the previous weeks. Then he looked at Fletcher. "Who's this?" he said. "My apprentice." Fletcher said without looking up from the piece he was examining. Harlan looked at the boy again. The boy looked back at him with the same level, unhurried calm that he brought to most things. The calm of a person who had decided, somewhere in the high country 11 days' walk north of here, that he was done with apology. "I need that axle done by Thursday," Harlan said. "It'll be done by Wednesday," Fletcher said. Harlan stood there for another moment in the way of a man who had come prepared to have an argument, and found that the other party had declined to provide one. Then he set the axle down against the fence post and walked back the way he had come. Fletcher looked at the axle. Then he looked at the boy. "You've been watching me work axles for 2 weeks," he said. "You ready to try one?" The boy looked at the axle. He looked at the forge. "Yes," he said. "Then get it up on the bench," Fletcher said. "I'll be right here." Now, if you're still with me here by the fire, I'm glad. If these stories are helping you rest, a quiet subscribe and a tap on that bell means I can keep them coming one night at a time. But let's get back to Redstone, because something is about to change. The axle took most of that afternoon and the following morning. The boy worked it with Fletcher, watching, not hovering, not correcting every motion, but present in the particular way that a good teacher is present, available, attentive, and silent until silence was no longer the right tool. He made 2 mistakes. Fletcher pointed them out in the same flat, informative tone he used for everything else. No impatience, no disappointment. Just, here's what happened, here's why it happened, here's what to do instead. The boy corrected them. The axle, when it was done, was good work. Not perfect, but good. Fletcher looked it over for a long time. He ran his thumb along the repaired section, checking the seam. "Harlan's going to try to find something wrong with it," he said. "I know," the boy said. "He won't find anything," Fletcher said. He set the axle down. Good work. But the boy understood by then that good work from Fletcher Kane was not a casual observation. It was the equivalent, in most other men, of a standing ovation. The town had been watching all of this. Redstone was a small town, which meant that it functioned, in certain ways, like a single organism. Information moved through it the way blood moves through a body. And very little happened on the main street or in the forge yard or at the general store that didn't eventually reach everyone who lived there. The story of the boy and the axle made its way around town within 24 hours. Reactions were mixed. Gideon Marsh at the dry goods store said it didn't change anything. The school teacher, a woman named Ida Colworth, who had come from Ohio 4 years earlier and had opinions about the frontier that differed from most of her neighbors, said it was about time. The saloon men continued to have their saloon opinions, but said them somewhat more quietly after Harlan Dowd came in on Thursday, picked up his axle, turned it over in his hands for a long time, and said nothing at all, which was, coming from Harlan Dowd, something close to a compliment. But the most important reaction happened at the edge of the forge yard on a Thursday evening in late October, and it involved neither Harlan Dowd, nor Gideon Marsh, nor Ida Colworth. It involved a boy named Caleb Reyes, who was 11 years old, the son of the man who ran the livery stable, and who had been conducting a dedicated surveillance of the forge from a distance for the better part of 3 weeks. Caleb Reyes had, as far as anyone could tell, no particular reason to be interested in the forge. His father worked horses, not iron. But there was something about the fire, or perhaps something about the boy who worked beside it, that had been pulling at him the way certain things pull at 11-year-olds, with no logic and no apology and no apparent intention of stopping. On that Thursday evening, Caleb Reyes walked up to the edge of the forge yard and stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking at the boy with the direct, unself-conscious assessment that only children and animals can manage without it becoming rude. The boy looked back at him. "What are you making?" Caleb said. The boy held up the piece he was working on, a simple hook, the kind used to hang tools on a wall. He turned it so the boy could see the curve of it, the way the metal had been shaped. "Can I watch?" Caleb said. The boy considered this for a moment. Then he moved slightly to one side, making room at the edge of the forge where the heat was strong but not overwhelming. "Stand here," he said. "Don't touch anything." Caleb came and stood where he was told. He watched. He didn't say anything else for a long time. When the hook was done, the boy held it out, and Caleb took it carefully in both hands and turned it over, examining it with the reverence that children bring to objects that have been made rather than bought. "What's your name?" Caleb said. The boy looked at the fire for a moment. Then he said, "Eli." It was the first time he had said it out loud. He wasn't sure until the moment it came out that it was going to be that name. But there it was, Eli, a name he had heard once, years ago, in a different context entirely. A name that didn't belong to his old life or to the town he was standing in, but to some third place in between. A name that was his because he had chosen it, and because choosing was the point, Caleb nodded, as if this were entirely unremarkable. "I'm Caleb," he said. "I know," Eli said. "I've seen you watching." Caleb had the grace to look briefly embarrassed. Then he grinned. "You want to come for supper?" he said. "My ma makes tamales on Thursdays." He looked at the forge, where the fire was settling down toward the end of the working day. He thought about the cot in the back room and the dried biscuits that were his usual Thursday evening. "All right," he said. The name spread through Redstone the way names do in small towns, not all at once, but in layers, reaching different people at different times through different channels, until eventually it was simply the name he had, the way the forge was simply the forge, and the water tower was simply the water tower. He was Eli now. Just Eli, no family name, no second name, which was unusual enough in Redstone to be occasionally commented on, but not unusual enough to be treated as a serious problem. There were other men in the territory who went by one name. Some of them had their reasons, and some of them didn't. And most people had learned over time that asking directly was generally less productive than simply waiting. November came, and with it, the particular quality of cold that the New Mexico high desert produces. Not the bone-deep wet cold of the north, but a dry, sharp cold that arrived every night with the setting of the sun and retreated every morning with its rising, as if the temperature were a creature with a daily schedule. Eli worked the mornings in the forge, where the fire kept the worst of the cold at bay. He spent the afternoons on repair work, the patient, methodical work of maintaining the town's tools and equipment that constituted most of a working blacksmith's actual income. Wagon wheels, plow blades, door hinges, the endless small objects that kept a frontier town functional, each one requiring its own particular attention, each one teaching him something that the previous one hadn't. Fletcher watched him work more and more without correcting. That, Eli was learning, was the highest form of praise available in the forge. He had supper with the Reyes family on 3 more Thursdays. Caleb's mother, serious woman named Lucia, who looked at Eli the first time with careful assessment, and the second time with something warmer, set a plate for him without being asked. Caleb's father, Roberto, asked questions about the forge that were genuine and specific, the questions of a man who worked with animals and understood the value of a craftsman who understood his tools. They talked about horses and iron and the winter that was coming, and no one asked Eli where he had come from. And Eli ate his tamales and felt, for the first time in a long time, something close to ordinary. But the rest of the town was slower. There were still days, not every day, but enough days, when the men outside the saloon found something to say as he passed. When Gideon Marsh at the dry goods store managed to be busy with something behind the counter at precisely the moment Eli arrived with a small purchase. When strangers passing through town looked at him with a particular look that meant they were calculating something and hadn't finished yet. Eli absorbed all of it with the stillness he had brought down from the high country. Not because it didn't land. It landed. He felt it the way you feel weather. As a fact of the environment, something to be aware of, to move around, to prepare for. But he had decided sometime during those 11 days of walking that he was not going to let other people's calculations determine his direction. He had chosen Redstone. He had chosen the forge. He had chosen the name Eli. These were his choices, and he was going to stand in them. Fletcher, for his part, continued to be exactly what he had been from the first morning, a man who saw what was in front of him and responded to it, without apparent reference to anything else. There was one afternoon in late November when 2 men, brothers passing through, the kind of men whose horses were expensive and whose manners were not, rode into the forge yard and asked for their horses to be reshod. They spoke to Fletcher. When Fletcher indicated that Eli would be handling the work, the older of the 2 brothers said something that was intended to be quiet and wasn't. Eli went ahead and shod the horses. He did it correctly, efficiently, and without any visible response to what had been said. When it was done, Fletcher looked at the work, nodded, and charged the brothers double what the job would normally have cost. The brothers looked at him. "That's not the standard rate," the older one said. "No," Fletcher agreed, "it isn't." There was a pause. The brothers paid. They rode out. Fletcher watched them go, then turned back to the forge. "Good shoeing," he said. Eli said nothing. But something shifted slightly in the space behind his sternum. Something that had been held tight for a long time and was, very carefully, beginning to let go. December arrived, and with it the event that the town of Redstone would talk about for a long time afterward. Not because it was dramatic in the way that frontier towns associated with drama. No gunfire, no horses at full gallop, no burning buildings. But because of what it revealed about what had been quietly building for 3 months in the forge on the south end of the main street. The fire started on a Wednesday night in the livery stable at the north end of town. No one ever determined exactly how it began. The leading theory was a lantern knocked over by a spooked horse. The stable held 12 horses that night. Roberto Reyes's own animals, plus 3 belonging to a group of travelers who had stopped for the night. The fire moved fast. Fires in wooden buildings always did. By the time the alarm went up, the stable's north wall was fully involved. Eli heard the shouting from the back room of the forge. He was out the door before he had fully registered what he was hearing. Moving north along the main street, toward the orange light that was already bright enough to read by. The town was waking up, doors opening, figures running in the half-dark, voices calling back and forth. The stable was a wall of heat and noise by the time he reached it. Roberto Reyes was at the main door, trying to get it open against the pressure of the smoke, shouting for the horses he could hear screaming inside. 3 other men were there already, pulling at the door with him. Eli pushed through them. He had grown up around fires. Not structure fires, field fires, the fires of ceremony, the contained and managed fires of camp life. He understood fire the way a person understands a language they grew up speaking, not as a set of rules, but as a living thing with its own logic, its own preferences, its own predictable behaviors. He could read the smoke coming under the door, see what it was telling him about where the fire was, and how much room there might still be to move. He got the door open, he went in, he brought out 3 horses in the first 2 minutes, not by force, but by something closer to conversation. The low, steady voice and deliberate movement that he had watched Roberto Reyes use 100 times in the past 3 months. Adapted now to chaos and heat, and the particular terror of an animal that cannot see an exit. He talked to them the whole time. He didn't know if they understood anything beyond the tone, but the tone was enough. On the 4th trip, he found Caleb. The boy had come in ahead of the adults. Of course he had. 11-year-olds with horses they loved always did, and had gotten turned around in the smoke. He was crouched in the far corner of the stable, coughing, one arm over his face, one arm around the neck of his father's oldest mare. Both of them were past the point of moving on their own. Eli got the horse out first. It was the only way to get Caleb to come willingly. Then he went back for Caleb, who was barely conscious by then, and carried him out over his shoulder into the cold night air of the Redstone street. Lucia Reyes made a sound when she saw her son that Eli would remember for the rest of his life. He set Caleb down on the ground and stepped back. The boy was coughing hard but breathing. He would have a sore chest for a week and a story to tell for the rest of his life. He was going to be all right. Eli stood at the edge of the crowd that had gathered and felt the cold night air on his face, which was hot from the fire and wet from the sweat. His hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the particular physical aftermath of intense effort, the body's way of releasing what it had been holding. He hadn't noticed the shake until now. Fletcher was standing 10 feet away, watching him. Fletcher said nothing. He looked at Eli for a long moment, at the smoke-darkened face, and the shaking hands, and the particular stillness of a person who has just done something significant and is not sure yet what to do with that. Fact. Then he gave a single, slow nod. It was, from Fletcher Kane, the equivalent of a speech. The town of Redstone did not transform overnight. Towns rarely do. People who had held opinions for 60 years did not abandon them because a young man had carried a child out of a burning building. And to expect otherwise would have been naive. But things shifted, the way a river shifts, not all at once, but in the accumulation of small changes that you don't notice until one day the course is different, and you can't quite remember exactly when it happened. Gideon Marsh at the dry goods store stopped being busy behind the counter when Eli came in. He didn't say anything about it, didn't acknowledge the change or offer any explanation. He simply stopped. One day he was busy and the next day he wasn't. And the transaction that followed was conducted with the same brisk practicality that Marsh brought to all his transactions. And that was that. Harlan Dowd came back to the forge with more work. He still didn't speak to Eli directly, not for a long time. But he stopped speaking in the pointed way he had been speaking, stopped making the small, oblique comments that were designed to register disapproval without technically constituting a confrontation. He came in, he left his work, he paid it up, he paid. That was its own kind of progress. The men outside the saloon found other things to talk about. Caleb Reyes, once he had recovered enough from the smoke to argue, became a fixture at the forge on weekend afternoons, watching everything and touching nothing. Or rather, touching exactly as much as Eli allowed him to touch, which gradually increased as it became clear that the boy's interest was genuine and his attention was serious. Eli taught him the names of the tools. He taught him how to read the color of the iron. He let him work the bellows on easy pieces, explaining the relationship between the air and the heat with the same patient, sufficient economy that Fletcher had used with him. Lucia Reyes sent food to the forge twice a week. She didn't announce it, and she didn't explain it. She sent it with Caleb, who delivered it with the matter-of-fact dignity of a person performing an obvious and unremarkable task. Eli ate it and said nothing to Caleb about it, and said nothing to Lucia about it when he saw her, and she said nothing to him about it. And in this way an arrangement was established that suited everyone and required no discussion. Roberto Reyes came to the forge one afternoon in January and asked Eli to look at a horse's shoe that wasn't sitting right. Eli looked at it. He found the problem, a small asymmetry in the fit that was causing the horse to favor one side, and corrected it. Roberto watched him work with the assessment of a man who understood skilled work when he saw it, in whatever form it came. "Good hands," Roberto said, when it was done. "Thank you," Eli said. Roberto nodded. He paid the small fee that Fletcher charged for such work, and as he was leaving, he paused and turned back. "My wife says you should come to Christmas supper," he said, "if you want to." Eli looked at him. "I'd like that," he said. Roberto nodded again and went back to his horses. Eli went back to the forge. Fletcher, who had been watching all of this from the other side of the forge, with the expression of a man who is carefully not reacting to something, picked up his hammer and went back to work. But that evening, after the last customer had gone and the forge fire had been banked for the night, Fletcher Kane did something he had never done in the 3 months Eli had been working for him. He poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the forge side table, and he held one out to Eli without saying anything. Eli took it. They stood by the cooling forge in the January evening, drinking coffee, not talking. The town was quiet outside. Somewhere down the street a door opened and closed. Somewhere further away, a horse made its opinion known about something, and then went quiet. After a while, Fletcher said, "How are your hands?" Eli looked at his hands. The palms were thick now, calloused in the specific places that forge work demanded. They were undeniably a blacksmith's hands. "Good," he said. Fletcher nodded. He drank his coffee. "There's enough work here for 2, he said, "if you want to stay on." It was made in the same flat, practical tone that Fletcher used for everything. The tone of a man stating a logistical fact, not making a declaration. But Eli understood, as he had learned to understand most things about Fletcher Kane, that the flatness of the tone was not an indicator of the weight behind it. "I want to stay on," Eli said. Fletcher finished his coffee. He set the cup down on the forge side table. "All right," he said. then you do. Spring came to Redstone the way it always did, slowly at first, and then all at once. The cold nights thinned out. The mornings arrived earlier. The land around the town, which had been brown and still for months, began to show the first tentative green of grass coming back to itself, and the particular quality of the light changed from the thin, flat light of winter to something warmer and more forgiving. Eli had been in Redstone for 6 months. He was not, by any measure, the same person who had stood on the ridge above the town on a pale September morning and looked down at the smoke from the forge. He was still himself. The same quality of stillness, the same economy of word and motion, the same level attention he brought to every task. But there was something different in the way he occupied the space around him. Something less provisional, less like a man who was ready to leave, and more like a man who had decided to stay. His hands were a blacksmith's hands. His eyes read iron the way Fletcher's eyes did. By color, by behavior, by the sound it made under the hammer. He knew the names of every tool in the forge and the purpose of each one, and more than that, he knew the personality of each one, which hammer was best for fine work, which tongs ran a little loose and needed compensating for, which part of the anvil rang truest. He had a name, he had a place to sleep. He had the Reyes family on Thursday evenings and Caleb's running commentary on the weekend. And Ida Colworth, the school teacher who had started stopping by the forge on her way home to discuss things with a seriousness that suggested she had decided he was worth discussing things with. He had not gone back to the high country. He did not know if he ever would. But one evening in late April, he was working alone in the forge. Fletcher had gone to see about a land dispute 2 miles out of town, an errand that had become unexpectedly extended. When he heard footsteps at the edge of the forge yard, he looked up. The man standing at the edge of the yard was not from Redstone. He was older, perhaps 60, and he carried himself with the particular bearing of a man who had spent his life in country that demanded physical awareness. He wore the clothes of the frontier, weathered and practical, but there was something about the way he stood that was not quite the same as the way Redstone men stood. Eli set down his hammer. He looked at the man. The man looked at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then the man said, in a language that Eli had not spoken in 6 months, that Eli had not expected to hear in this place, that landed in his chest with a weight he had not been prepared for. Your father sent me to find you. He wanted you to know he is well. He wanted to know if you are well. The forge fire crackled behind him. Down the street, someone was closing up a shop for the evening. From the direction of the livery, Caleb's voice was audible, talking to one of the horses in the particular tone he used with the old mare. Eli looked at the forge fire for a long moment. Then he looked back at the man. Tell him, he said in the same language, the words coming back to him as naturally as breathing, that I am well. Tell him I found work. Tell him I found good work and good people. He paused. Tell him the fire here is warm, he said. Tell him I am learning to tend it. The man nodded. He looked at the forge for a moment, at the fire, at the iron laid out on the bench, at the hands that were holding the hammer with the ease of a man who had earned the right to hold it that way. He will be glad, the man said. Then he turned and walked back the way he had come, and in a few moments the sound of his horse was gone down the road, and Redstone was quiet again. Eli stood by the forge for a long time after that. He thought about the fire he had grown up beside, the fire of the camp, the fire of ceremony, The fire his mother had tended with the same patient, daily devotion that kept all fires alive. He thought about the fire behind him now, the forge fire that Fletcher Kane had kept burning for 30 years, that Eli was now, in some sense, entrusted to keep as well. Two fires, different in form, different in purpose, different in every practical way. But fire was fire. It had the same needs, the same nature, the same capacity to warm and to shape, and if you were not careful, to consume. He had learned to tend one. He was learning to tend the other. He thought this was, perhaps, the thing he had been trying to find when he walked down off the ridge on a pale September morning with worn-out boots and a name he wasn't ready to use yet. Not an answer, not a resolution, not the end of anything complicated. Just two fires, both of them real, both of them his. He picked up his hammer. He turned back to the iron. The evening came in slowly, the way spring evenings do, the light thickening from gold to amber to the deep, quiet blue that settled over the forge yard and softened all the edges of things. Somewhere in the distance, the last of the birds were deciding where to spend the night. Eli worked until the light was gone, and the fire told him it was time to stop. Then he banked the coals, hung the hammer in its place on the rack where every tool had its correct place, and went out into the redstone evening. The stars were coming out. He looked up at them the way he had looked up at them all his life, with the particular attention of a person for whom the sky had always been a map of something, though the thing it was a map of had changed over time as he had changed. He was 20 years old. He had a name. He had a forge. He had a town that was still making up its mind about him, the way towns do, the way people do, the way the world does, slowly, imperfectly, one small shift at a time. He had two fires, and he knew how to tend them both. That was enough. For tonight, standing under the April stars in Redstone, New Mexico, with the smell of iron on his hands and the warmth of the forge still in his clothes, that was more than enough. And that is the way I heard it told. The fire is getting low now. The night is deep, and the stars are out, and somewhere in Redstone, in whatever remains of that small town and the people who made it what it was, the memory of two fires is still burning, the way good things burn, quietly, steadily, long after anyone thought they had enough fuel to keep going. You rest easy tonight, friend. You've earned it. And if this story gave you a quiet place to land, if Eli's fire kept you warm a little while, I'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who could use a peaceful night. Leave me a word in the comments. Tell me where the fire took you tonight. I read every one. I will be right here next time you need a story. The fire will be burning, same as always. Good night.